World history class. Welcome back, guys. Hope everybody's doing well. We are on our last lesson of week 4 of digital learning. That's crazy. And the end of the school year will be here before we know it, less than a month. So we got to keep cooking, and we got a lot of history left to cover in a short amount of time. So I'm going to move fast. Today, we're going to talk about Joseph Stalin. We talked about Lenin yesterday, and Stalin was mentioned as well. That's a fine mustache he has. And I would know because I'm now the proud owner of a stash. Stop by our daily Zoom meetings and check it out. So we're going to talk Stalin, and then after that, we're going to shift gears and start talking about Israel, the creation of Israel, because that was made in 1948. So that's right here, right after the war. It's a new topic for us, but kind of an extension of that era. And we haven't talked about the Middle East really in quite a while. So FDR had the 100 days. Stalin had the 5 year plan. He had the first 5 year plans, which were from 28 to 33, and that included increasing industrialization, pardon the spelling, agricultural reform, and that reform took the shape of communizing um, agriculture. So taking people's private small farms and consolidating them into a larger farm. And then state agriculture, when we see something, when we're talking world history, when we see the word state, you can just think country. So change the setup, the farming system. He eliminated private enterprise. Enterprise in that context just means business. He eliminated private businesses. He took steps to improve education and transportation. Both of those things were lacking in Russia. Really, all of these things. It was not well industrialized at the time. The farming was not thriving. There were uh, famines. I was trying to think what a period of extended mass hunger is, but there were famines. Um, then he comes out with the third 5 year plan, 33 to 38. So he does take steps, and there is some success. His objectives, like we said, industrialization, socialized farming, elimination of private enterprise, education, transportation improvements, and trying to keep the Soviet Union on track to keep up with the other world powers. Stalin believed that attention to education was necessary, so you would have a skilled industrial force, and he felt like improvements in transport would help move raw materials, manufactured products, and agricultural produce. So, in order to reach the targets that he had in terms of education, agriculture, etc., first thing he needed to do was improve transportation. So he started expanding the railroad system. So down here, the third dot says output was to be doubled in 5 years for iron and steel production and in electricity, chemicals, and engineering. and they started to reach those goals. So then they expanded, they increased their targets, and they took down the time window. So instead of 5 years, Stalin expected them to finish it in 4 years. Stalin really loves to trumpet how successful this program was, but it did have its troubles. There were early successes, largely because things were just so poor to begin with that it was hard not to improve. Um, but still, Stalin did not recognize or acknowledge, let alone acknowledge, those issues. Propaganda is a like saying what an awesome job you're doing. You know, modern politicians do that as well, and Stalin, especially Soviet Russia, is particularly famous for suppressing dissenting opinions, so not letting people speak out against the government. And Russia is they're just masters of state-sponsored propaganda. The second, where the first one focused more on raw minerals, materials, the second one tried to encourage industries that produce consumer goods like clothing. But in 1934, the Soviet Union realizes they start to think that things are shaping up potentially for another war, possibly even another world war. So they decided that instead of building those consumer goods, instead of producing those consumer goods, they were going to focus on making materials for war. And in the third 5 year plan, it stayed pretty much the same. They were heavily focused on military expansion. During that third 5 year plan, lo and behold, Russia was right. There was a war coming, and Germany invades the Soviet Union in 1941. Impact increase in coal, iron, steel, oil, more than 1,500 factories, 100 new cities, transportation, communication improved. There were, of course, poor working conditions. We talked about that in when we were talking about the American Industrial Revolution. I know we talked about that in U.S. history. I'm not sure if we did in here. I think we did, but the point is, things were every bit as bad, if not worse. Probably worse in a lot of cases in the Soviet Union. Protesters, protests started popping up again among workers, but unlike the United States and Soviet Russia, they don't have the right to protest like that. So the government would jail you. They wouldn't think twice about throwing you in jail. Stalin also felt like the population was uneducated. So he starts founding colleges, schools, universities, and primary education. So like, up through primary school, that was now required legally. Excuse me, guys. A lot of Russians froze. They had a hard time during the winters because Russia was spending all of its effort making military goods, so just basic stuff was hard to come by, and they started rationing them. I have a book, a ration book from my late grandmother from World War II, where, and she was not Soviet. This is America, but basically there were only, for certain goods you could only buy so many of them. So these workers who were already getting paid very little, their money became worth even less. However, things do start to pick up, and rationing ends in 1936. That's a question on today's assignment. So if you're watching this, write that down. They got cheap meals, free uniforms. When people are freezing, a free uniform is quite an incentive. Free education, subsidized health care, parks, cinemas. He improved life in Russia. He was extremely oppressive and a murderous dictator, but he did improve the day to day. So, why did Stalin want to collectivize farms in Russia? Felt like if farming methods were improved, fewer people would be needed to work the land. That meant that some of the people in the countryside would be able to move to the cities to work in the factories. So one reason he wanted to to collectivize these farms was to free up workers for all these new factory positions. They'd also be able to grow more crops. The Soviet Union would be able to sell the extra crops to other countries, and that profit could be used to pay for new factories. So this farming is all being done in the name of industry. A lot of farmers didn't like this. Obviously, their farms were basically being confiscated. So we started seeing peasant revolts, and these farmers are killing officials. They're getting in armed conflicts with uh, agricultural ministers. No, just a second, guys. So Stalin, he's not having it, and eventually they send troops in, and a lot of these farmers, the ones who weren't willing to play ball, they were suppressed. There were riots. So farmers rioted. They armed themselves as best they could and attacked uh, people trying to take the government, people trying to take their land. Stalin ordered 17 million horses to be killed so that farmers would be forced to use tractors. But there weren't enough tractors to replace all the horses that had been killed. How brutal is that? Literally killed 17 million horses so he could force peasant farmers to purchase tractors that they couldn't afford and that had not been built yet. And if you wouldn't cooperate, you were sent to prison camps. Basically, they called them gulags. And they dealt with food shortages for years because of all this unrest in the farming community. And there were also droughts, floods, it was just bad times for farming in Russia. The U.S. actually offered food, but Stalin rejected it. That's also on your assignment. It's a true false question. And like I said, he wanted to project a strong image. So He wouldn't allow information about the famine to be printed. And some of these confiscated crops even sold to raise money. It was all about industry with him. So, estimated final numbers, over 10 million peasants and their families died. That's on your assignment as well. Stalin's going to keep growing in the 30s. Okay, scratch that. That's clearly highly inflammatory.